Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 243 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on the 21st of May 2022. This is the official podcast for the fan site avatarthelastairbender.online.com. I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime, and joining me on the podcast is Greg 2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's show, we have news to cover, a couple of negative pieces, but one very interesting piece if it turns out to be true. And then we also will be continuing our rewatch of both Avatar and Korra with the episode 4s from each show. So, for Korra, The Voice in the Night, and for Avatar, The Warriors of Kyoshi. So, we'll be reviewing both of those episodes later on this podcast. So we'll start with the news, and we'll start with the new Avatar Legends role-playing game update. So this is update number 30, which is called Wan Shi Tong Adventure Guide Files, Project Updates, and Print Preview. So basically all they're saying here with the Wan Shi Tong stuff is that the final version of that book is going up at some point. I don't think we're expecting anything new apart from basically spelling mistakes corrected and stuff like that with the Wan Shi Tong stuff. So they're just basically doing a brief update on that. The negative news here, and it's actually pretty negative, and the wording here sort of does their best to say that it's not as negative as it seems to be, but it certainly comes across as quite negative, and we'll get into that. And then the print preview obviously is kind of what we've been waiting for, which is pictures of what the final product is actually going to look like. And so they show us pictures of basically all of the physical items here and give us a slightly better look at them. So that's pretty good. So I suppose we'll cover the negative thing at the end. But do you have any thoughts on the do you think there'll be anything new out of the Wan Shi Tong, and what are your thoughts on the print preview?
Yeah, I don't really expect too much out of the updates on Wan Shi Tong's Adventure Guide. Like you said, it's mostly like editing updates and other things along that nature. As for the images that they posted, I think those look pretty cool. I mean, even if these are sort of like the early versions of them, I think seeing them in the actual physical form, just through these images, makes it seem a lot more real than what it has been, from everything that they've been saying. So the fact that they've at least got that far in the process is, that part is pretty positive, at least.
Yeah, like the stuff definitely looks good. In terms of like changes, it seems like one of the journals, they've changed it from being more of a shadowed version of the Aang Korra image to just being the standard image, which I think is fine. They changed the color of the sort of deluxe leather bag to being navy, in line with like a lot of the other stuff. Though I still maintain the standard dice bag looks a lot better. We get our first look at what I think the combat action deck actually is, because you get to see a few of the cards in one of the pictures. So it does look like you're just going to get sort of like a plain card for each of the NPC legends, and then all the technique cards are going to have screenshots from the show on them. So at least that'll be somewhat interesting to look at kind of from a visual perspective. And then the only slightly negative thing for me would be just the stitching on the sides of the cloth map seems a little bit like not great, but maybe it's just an early situation there. But does anything specifically from the print preview sort of stand out to you, getting a look at it kind of more final version?
Not too much. I mean, I do like the Pai Sho tile. I think it's cool to actually see how that really looks as an object for some reason out of all the items that they have here so far. But no, I think overall I really like that, they're making these items, and that, people who are really looking forward to them when they do get them will, hopefully enjoy them.
Yeah. Now for the negative news, the printing update. So I'll just read this out and then we can discuss it. Unfortunately, we have some regrettable news. The printer we're working with is currently functioning at about 30% capacity due to COVID lockdowns. This means they can't give us a solid timeline on when the product will finish printing and when it will be sent out to us. Even at full capacity, it will take several months to print all of the books because of how many amazing backers supported the project. Sadly, with the reduced capacity, it may take longer. We're communicating with them to ensure we have the most up-to-date information. We'll communicate to you when that comes in. They can't estimate anything on the timeline. So much is in flux. COVID, materials, shipping. Thank you for being understanding. Basically, it's the first paragraph of this that the significant stuff is. It's weird because I think the first time I read this, I was just like, okay, delay. But then I went back through it and was just like, no, well, wait, they say even at full capacity, which it's not at, it will take several months. So already, even at full capacity, it's still a delay. But they're at 30% capacity, so is this 3 times the delay? Obviously, I don't think that's exactly how it works, but close-ish to that, because these were meant to ship out in February initially. Now, they confirmed a delay to the physical stuff ages ago to more like the middle of the year, but we're basically there. So several months, I'm assuming that means at least 3. We're talking like August into September, and at 30% capacity, we gotta assume that's at least maybe double that. So I think we're going to be lucky to see any of this stuff this year. And then there's the potential for this to go a little bit out of control going into next year as well, because they have had delays to a lot of their other projects. I think everyone's been thinking they won't let this one get as far out of control as those ones, but it's definitely beginning to go that way. And I think you've been beginning to see the community, like, which has been super positive a lot of the time, just begin to turn a little bit more on this, because as people have pointed out, the last update was about how they've moved the printing to China, and now it seems like that decision has actually caused more delays for them, because it's not just getting the books printed, but they also had to get them shipped then from China to Magpie in America, and then from there to other people. So it just feels like, okay, well, what's going on here? They're not quite clearly saying just how serious I think this delay actually is. But what are your thoughts on the printing update here?
Yeah, this is, pretty bad news for pretty much everyone who's really been invested in this, and it's really unfortunate because it did do so well, so it has so much I guess you could say writing on it in general, just because of all of the publicity and everyone involved, and the different partners and the IP that it has, which is of course why it got this popular in the first place. So it's almost like it's been like a double-edged sword to be like this popular, where they felt that they had to take the production of this somewhere that is regrettably having all of these delays and everything else with it, which it's not to say that it wouldn't have had similar issues if it was printing anywhere else, if it could even print this much at this capacity, but it is really, really bad news for people who were like hopefully wanting to use the stuff this year, the summer, to actually play the games with people and everybody. So like that's kind of a downer, even though, of course, like they've said over and over again, you can play the game now. You do have the books in hand. It's just, part of the fun, I'm sure, for a lot of people is to actually have the real, physical items in their hands. That kind of adds to the whole feel of this, especially if you want to play, in person with people. So I don't know. It is really, really bad news to hear about this. And like you said, yeah, like I too would be surprised if, we wouldn't get anything from this until like this time next year, honestly, like the way that things are going right now. So I don't know. That's really unfortunate. And this, this is kind of like one of those classic Kickstarter things. If anyone's, done Kickstarter before, that this has been like a thing that happens on Kickstarter quite often, even in the best of times, either because of like overestimation on the cost and the process of actually getting things made, to just mismanagement of the funds in general. And it doesn't seem like there's been like a mismanagement of the actual like funds or anything like that. So thankfully it's not along those lines for this project, at least as far as we can tell. But it still comes down to when you actually get the things that you actually supported, for those who did support to those tier levels.
This is one of those things where, like, I get what they're saying here, in that, like, we don't want to give you an estimate until we have more up-to-date information. But if this is, like, a properly, like, really, really heavy delay, I don't really see what the problem is with them just saying that this is like a very, very early estimate. This will likely not be super accurate, but it looks like it will be 6, 7 months at the earliest. But it could roll over. Like say way more than you need to say to really clarify that it's an estimate, it's around this, but it could change. Because the wording at the moment feels like, okay, several months at full capacity, but it's not full capacity, so 3 times several months? Is it like you're sort of saying where this actually could end up being like middle of next year that we get this stuff? They've been doing this like the whole time through, I think, like in their wording being really, really optimistic. And then when stuff falls through, it feels really bad because you were being super optimistic when they probably should just be a little bit more blunt at this point, because it is going to end up being some sort of a bad delay. But, you know, it feels at this point like, what's the next update's going to be on this stuff? Like, I'd be shocked if we got an update next month that confirms that, like, oh yeah, we're going to hit August, or it feels like all the updates that we're going to get from here on out are just going to be kind of like negative until they finally can clarify some stuff. So it's definitely going to be a kind of rough couple of months, I think, for this. They do also mention, I think there's another brief thing, that like the All-Star Play game, they're filming it next month, and they'll have that up eventually in the fall. And then no update on the virtual tabletop. They're also going to be at some conventions. The other thing it makes me think about is that they also have the expansion books for Republic City and Spirit World, which I think they had like super early estimates on when they'd be coming out. But because of these delays now, all of a sudden, if they're doing another Kickstarter for them to get them going, I think a lot of people are going to maybe question if they should go for it because of how some of this stuff has been handled. Because I'm guessing the Republic City book might be having to get towards like, we've got to try and confirm this at some point. But what are your thoughts on that? How do you think this physical project stuff affects their plans for the other content?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to have some sort of effect just because of, the amount of people that are involved in this one and those who would have, initially considered any of their other projects. I mean, I would be surprised if they didn't make, depending on what their actual, goal is for the other project. I would be surprised if they didn't make it. But I know, I wouldn't expect it to be as, huge as this one currently is or was, just because of everything that's gone on with this project. I mean, there'll always be people that will, support it and whatnot. So I don't think it has like that sort of danger, but it definitely would cause me to think twice.
Yeah, it won't fail, but it won't be the runaway success that the a core game was. Next piece of news is also negative. We're going to try and get a lot of the negative news out of the way. With this one, there is a positive from this. So this is about the Avatar The Last Airbender 2023 Collector's Edition wall calendar. So popular item from last year. We talked about this getting announced a while back. The sort of preview images actually went up for it. I was one of the first people to find this, so this was kind of a little bit of a kind of news scoop during the week. But basically, the news as such is that we get a new Yoon. Yoon is like one of the new characters for one of the months. He is April, so we get one of his images from the Shadow of Kyoshi special edition for one of the months. We see that they're using Yang Chen for December, and that the only other new entry on this is that they're switching the Kyoshi image from last year to now being the Rise of Kyoshi cover. Otherwise, the calendar is the same. The positive news is that the quote for Yang Chen is something we've never heard her say anywhere before, meaning that it basically has to be from the Dawn of Yang Chen. So the Yang Chen quote says, "Better to parry the sword than heal the wound." So this got people thinking, a little bit of a kind of philosophy here. Is she saying like a pearl of wisdom here, or is this more of like a direct conversation she's having with like a waterbender? A lot of people have been speculating about that. But what are your thoughts on this? I suppose we'll talk about the quote first. What are your thoughts on her first line from the new book?
Yeah, I wonder how much, can be read into that in terms of the book and how it's going to play out. I mean, it could be, a statement that, she's told for all we know for that matter, but, definitely fits the character and what we know about her up until this point. So it's definitely, I guess, a nice little bit of buzz for the book, even though this, we'll get this way after, of course.
Yeah, it's a weird one to try and analyze because it's like, well, obviously you don't want to get like hurt by a sword attack, so yeah, why wouldn't you try and block it? It's like, is she talking to some weird waterbender who just like takes lots of damage with the knowledge they can heal it off, or is it just more of a thing where it's like use your skill rather than your powers type thing? Who knows? Maybe the character that we heard about in the description is a waterbender and this is part of their dynamic. Who really knows? But it fits for an airbender, I think, the idea of like avoid, evade, block rather than take damage. That fits. But yeah, the other aspect of this is that this was meant to be. This was originally stated to be, and it still says on the website, 12 new illustrations created especially for this calendar. Now, they have changed this. Like the original one that is still up there says Ang, Karuk, Yue, Kyoshi, and Yang Chen. The new one I think just says like Ang, Sokka, Katara, and Yang Chen. So this was originally scheduled to have a new Karuk image, a new Yue image, and potentially, I'm guessing, just new images across the board because they say that. What we end up getting is technically no new images because the Yang Chen book is just the cover. They've swapped out the Kyoshi one for cover. All the other images are the same, and the Yoon one is the only one that you could even in any way technically say is new. But even so, it was in the Shadow of Kyoshi special edition version. So, not sure what happened here. This feels like a relatively like simple like product in the sense that you just need like 12 images. So were they not able to get them done in time? I don't really know. Like, are there Karuk and Yue images out there or not? Who knows? But what are your thoughts on this? Massive change for this book that has led to a lot of people really being disappointed in the way it's turned out.
Yeah, I saw mention of that. I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I wonder, like some people have said if it's like a schedule thing or a commission thing, or if it's just like they just ran out of time in order to get stuff ready for the printers or whatever, along the lines of what we were just previously talking. I mean, there could be a whole host of delays. But yeah, that definitely, for people who were really looking forward to it for the new art, I think that definitely is a bit of a downer in terms of that regard. I mean, there are, some that are new-ish, or at least in this format. So there is that to consider. And I don't know, it makes me wonder. I mean, I guess for some of it, it might be worth it just to get it, just to sort of have it. But, that is definitely something that I think many people will consider.
Yeah. It's one of those ones I did have this pre-ordered on the basis of like what it was before, and I feel like I'm like this close to cancelling it, but I might just keep it just because it comes with a poster. It is just the cover of the Yang Chen book, which is the poster, but it's something. But yeah, what was a very cool item from last year, you took away a lot of the interesting aspects of it this year. I think what is especially probably the most egregious part of this is the cover is like identical, except they changed the sort of like kind of lighting effect around the Aang kind of orb from being like black to kind of more orangey red, and Aang is just like slightly more kind of bigger in the image. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. I think it's hilarious that they didn't even change the cover image like much at all. So this seems really weird. It is only coming out in November. I think it's been delayed a reasonable amount. And again, for a calendar that's meant to be, the 2023 calendar, like you have to get this out like before 2023. And you can tell by the fact that one of the features on it is that it has a September to December 2022 calendar. So it's theoretically one of those ones where like it's meant to be out in September. So it's at least, I suppose, 2 months delayed, more or less. But is that the reason why there's nothing new? It seems like extreme to go from 12 new illustrations down to 2 technically, but actually really 0. It's quite extreme. So that's a pretty disappointing piece of news. The last disappointing piece of news is Legend Korra Patterns in Time has been delayed again. It is now coming out October 4th, 2022. This is the same day as the Team Avatar Treasury. Is that what it's called? I keep forgetting the name of that book because it's so generic. It's the collected edition of the one-shot comics. So I think one or both of these books is going to change. I can't see these 2 books coming out on the same day. But again, Dark Horse, I don't think I've acknowledged this one yet. I don't think their website matches this just yet, but they haven't updated the website with the last 2 delays, even though basically everywhere else has. So this book is now super far off course as well, and there's no immediate thing that would suggest it's going to stop getting delayed at this point. I just don't get it, why it keeps happening. It's like consistently every single month this book gets a delay. I don't know why. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this? The what's this? The 6th, 7th delay for this book?
Yeah, this is just kind of funny and sad at this point. I don't know. I guess it's really too bad that they're not, mentioning at all what sort of the reason behind these particular delays, because I think that would go a long way towards like helping any sort of buzz that there was for this, which I don't know if there's any at this point.
Like people are excited for it because it's a Korra book. This is the 10-year anniversary year for Korra. That's what it's meant to be effectively. Some of the marketing for this, again on a Dark Horse blog post, was celebrate the 10-year anniversary with this book, which was originally scheduled for the day of the anniversary. Now it feels like there is a chance for this book to slip into next year as well. And that would just be silly for it to try and hit an anniversary and to just miss it like that, when there doesn't seem to be any obvious reason why it is slipping so much. When loads of other Dark Horse books can hit their dates, in the sense that like the North and South Omnibus edition came out the day it was meant to, on the day it was scheduled. That book didn't get a delay. The last art book, I think, was only delayed by maybe a week or 2. So it feels crazy that it just happens to be the case that some of the newer books are the ones that are getting wildly delayed, especially when this book doesn't actually have that much new content in it. I don't really buy that this is being delayed because of any sort of production issues. I think at this stage it is them just trying to stretch their releases out so that they can get through this sort of like content drought by just stretching the releases as much as they can. I don't know why they necessarily are doing that with this book, but once it comes out this year, I guess they'll be somewhat okay. But for sure, this is definitely looking like probably one of the weakest years for Dark Horse in terms of like kind of the PR communication side of things is terrible. And then the actual content that's coming out, like very little new stuff and very little new stuff that's interesting. So it feels like it's sort of like disaster after disaster for them. But hopefully towards the end of the year, they'll actually maybe be able to announce some stuff for next year. Because, I don't know, because this is a one-off book. So when this comes out, we're back to waiting for a next Korra comic trilogy. I don't know. where where do you think Dark Horse sort of go from here? Like Chibi Volume 2, is that it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, it doesn't really seem, from what we can tell on the outside here, what their plans really are for the future. I mean, I think, like we've mentioned before, it really does seem like they're held up by other forces, which, I guess could be good if they do have a bunch of stuff planned and, once they start hitting their stride, there's going to be like a stream of stuff going out. So if they are really, like what you said, if they're holding back in order to like stretch out the content, which I don't know. I don't necessarily think that's like the best way to go about it, considering that these are mentioned products or mentioned things from a long time ago that were already coming out. So I don't know. I don't. It is like you said. This doesn't really seem like it's been the best for them in terms of communicating, or at least for this particular property that they have.
Yeah, but like the two main new books, like the Chibi comic has been over a year delayed. This is now getting towards heavy delays. It's like 6 months now, I think it's been delayed. Um, might be delayed again. Beast of the Four Nations is the other book that actually has some hype behind it, but that book is in this weird, like, between worlds kind of status where, like, it is both announced and not announced at the same time, and it doesn't really have an official date, even though, like, we're getting close to the release of the book 4 Balance Art Book Deluxe Edition, leaving just the one spot at the end to finish off the deluxe set, the spine images with the slipcases. People are going to be annoyed if they're left waiting after buying all these expensive books, waiting for that last one. So I'm guessing that's something that they have. The proper reveal of Beast of the Four Nations as like a end of year thing will kind of have to be the case, because realistically, for it to be anyway in line with the rest of the series, it probably has to come out either November, December, January, or February. Just so it's somewhere in line with like a reasonable amount of time after the book 4 thing. But what do you think the situation is with a book like that, Beast of the Four Nations, where we've known about it for like a year now?
That's in a really weird limbo, right? Like it really feels like they're not really acknowledging that it really even exists at this point, considering, from when it was first mentioned and we were wondering how everything was going to work on the slipcases and how that whole layout was going to feel, which I think that was like a Twitch live stream or something like that when they originally were announcing all of that stuff. And it's been, so long at this point. I'm sure you probably can't even find like the original like mentions of that at this point. So I don't know what to really think about that one. I mean, and that one seemed like the most interesting out of all of them, because it actually felt like it was something new, which we, went on and on about of what could actually be there, and the new content and the images and art and stuff like that, which, in terms of that could actually make sense why that one might be delayed, because they actually have to produce new stuff for it, but that hasn't really been communicated at all. So we're kind of just left wondering on that front.
Yeah, like Dark Horse have never acknowledged that book. They've never posted about it. There's no listing for it on the Dark Horse website, and basically any website you can buy books from that has it listed has it in some sort of a status where it either has like a placeholder date, like 60 years from now, or it just says unavailable. So weirdness, and that's not good, I think, with a big book, to just be like, it's, we talked about it, I think, a bunch of months ago, about like it was technically in a like temporarily like cancelled status or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording there, but Edelweiss said it was like not officially listed anymore. So I don't know what the situation is, but we'll move on. So SDCC Special Edition Diamond Select Gallery Diorama here. So they teased this like the day before Diamond Select, and then it got announced. It is the Aang Gallery Diorama repainted into this version they're calling Antique. So it's basically Aang done to be like a statue. So he's kind of done in a bit of a sort of like brassy, bronzy type kind of paint job. They've even painted the clear effect part to be more sort of like white, almost like frosted. It's nice, but I'm always with these statues. I kind of ask like, why is this meant to be a statue in the Avatar world or not? This feels like it has a little bit of sepia tone Aang energy to it in terms of like, what's this repaint meant to be? It's not more expensive. It's the same price as the standard version, and it doesn't seem like it's like necessarily going to sell out. But I'll be honest, the simpler repaint of just making the standard statue Avatar state just by turning blue to white, I think would be a lot more interesting to me, even though it's kind of boring and like a basic repaint. But what are your thoughts on Antique Aang?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the overall look of it is pretty interesting. Like the fact that it is more of like statue look, and it, even though it does have sort of that the sepia tone vibes from the previous, ones that they've done in that sort of feel. I think this one feels like they took at least a little bit more effort in actually toning it, because it is, toned bronze, but it does still have some color shown through, especially like on the arrows and sort of the main sort of belt area. So, I think it is a cool thing. I think, in terms of like SDCC exclusives, if you're into that sort of stuff, this might actually be one that's actually worth getting. And like you said, like the price is, the standard price. So, you can still get it. And it seems like they're at least, shipping international. So if you're into that, you definitely have the option to get it via that method. So, I like the idea of it, in terms of, overall, product wise, it doesn't really seem like it has a whole bunch of like purpose overall. It's just like another quick repaint for, the con. So I don't know. It's nice, but it doesn't really add too much to anything for me personally.
Yeah, I think I'm just with most everyone else. Like, I didn't see much of a reaction to this really. Where the new gallery dioramas, you've teased a couple of times now. Like, I think they've said they're working on multiple new ones. So that's what I'm waiting for. I want to see the Toph. I want to see how they do an Earth effect, and I want to see if they do Sokka, Suki. Do they go for Team Avatar, and after that, who did they go on to? That's what I'm more invested in. I'd much rather get the new statue of a new character rather than just the same one with a kind of fancy paint job again. But it's there if you want it. Next, we go into some Netflix live-action Avatar series news. So, nothing crazy here, but I suppose maybe teasing the fact that some of the bigger news might be coming soon. So, it was announced that this visual effects company, Double Negative, I believe, or Deneg, if you want to go for that, are the ones doing the visual effects on the show. If you go to their website, they have a page for Avatar that says Avatar The Last Airbender, The Avatar Returns. It says trailer coming soon. And they do list a few credits here, like, okay, creators Mike DiMartino, Brian Konietzko, Albert Kim. Interestingly, like Avatar Studios is mentioned as a production company. But the main thing here is just that I don't think we knew this information before. I think Avatar News was the one who mainly mentioned that they did the special effects on the movie Dune, which is kind of cool. So they're sort of getting a major studio in to help with this. And then a related piece of news is just that apparently the Guinness Book of World Records has confirmed that the volume, the like custom built LED stage, is like the biggest in the world that they're using on Avatar. So that's kind of cool in terms of like they seem to be going all in with the technology. So they're going for it with the production. We just have to wait and see what it is. But Greg, what are your thoughts on these two kind of smaller announcements?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know we're not like super huge on the whole live action side of things, but the idea that they are having DNEG work with, Netflix, and I saw somewhere else that they have like a huge sort of like basically like agreement or contract with Netflix in terms of doing the visual effects for a lot of different Netflix shows. So it's not just Avatar on its own, but it's a lot of different productions that Netflix is doing. And it just happens to be that for this one, they're putting a lot of, they're using that, sort of connection that they have to hopefully make, the effects as big as they can. So the idea that they are doing the volume and that, that's going to be working in conjunction with, sort of the on location stuff that I've seen some other places report on as well. So it's not, for those who are like concerned about that, it's not just only going to be in the volume. They're also going to do it in like, real actual physical locations as well, which, ideally would work well, hopefully at least. Those are, I guess, some positives that you can try to glean despite, all of the overall, controversy that has gone with, sort of the live action version of the show. So, I mean, it gives you, I guess, a little bit more, hope from that side of things if that's something that you were worried about, comparing it to the previous live action time that they did this for Avatar. So I don't know. I'm, still hesitant to see how it all works out because, again, a lot of it'll depend on the actual story and how they choose to go with that and how the actors work and everything. So there's, of course, a lot of different pieces to it rather than just the effects, which I think, we've mentioned before that some of the effects aren't horrible in the previous one. They're just sort of not well, placed in terms of the staging and the scenes and everything like that. So still a wait and see thing, but it is nice to know that maybe something might be soon for those who really sort of interested in it. So I wonder what that soon actually means in terms of actually seeing how stuff looks in context.
Yeah, that's what I was going to discuss. Yeah, trailer coming soon. Is that them just saying, like, it's like a placeholder thing of like, the trailer will go here when it's out? Does it actually mean there is one actually coming soon? There is this Netflix Geeked Week coming up, which is the second week in June. I'm looking at it here, Monday, June 6th to Friday, June 10th. They put out a trailer. They're going to be revealing lots of stuff about all different series and so on. And obviously because it's geeked, it's more like pop culture-y. I believe the trailer even has a tease of like Dragon Prince season 4 news, so that's kind of also interesting. There was no, I think, obvious suggestion of Avatar, but because that would technically be something new, I guess it could be a surprise announcement. But I'm guessing over the course of this week, Netflix Geek Week, SDCC or NYCC, we're going to get the trailer for the live action show. And then we can finally, I think, properly talk about it to see how they're doing things, because like you mentioned, the Last Airbender movie like looks fine. Like it's mostly fine. Like they put the effort in, and for it being like 10 plus years old at this point, it's like, okay, the production side of things was actually like relatively all right. It was obviously the writing department, what they actually chose to film, what they gave the actors to work with, that was where the problems came in. That's the same problem with like the recent Halo TV show, which also has like a huge production budget and does all this other stuff in terms of looking great, but when the stuff that you see on screen doesn't like feel like Halo, that's when kind of some of the problems begin to come in. So this could be the highest budget show in the entire world, but if they turn Roku into a dragon again, there's not much you can really do. So it's all about those decisions, and like when we see the characters, do they feel like the characters? And especially with book one, what are they keeping in? What are they removing? That sort of thing. That's what I am interested to see. So yeah, hopefully, maybe coming up in the next couple of weeks, we do get some information on it. And that's the thing. Like right now, I don't know what real way to feel about the live action. But when the trailer comes out, I think it probably will change things. And I don't know, but where are you at with the Netflix show? Are you kind of really all on like, yeah, trailer, first episode, that's where the main news is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see how that gets received by everybody. Like, I can just see already all the reactions to it and how that's gonna play out, either positive or negative based on how it actually looks. So I think for me, that's definitely when I will hold any sort of, main thoughts on how it's going to be. I don't know. I guess I'm not really foresight hyped for this, considering everything.
Yeah, like it'll completely depend on what it looks like. But yeah, then we get to the big piece of news here. So straight away, I think we have to sort of roughly class these as like it's rumors, it's insider information we're going to be talking about here. None of this is confirmed, but because there has actually, in the grand scheme of things, been basically no rumors even about Avatar Studios, these feel quite good and realistic. So there's two things here. It's information about two Avatar Studios projects. Both of them movies, films, whatever you want to call them. Two different ones. So I believe the first piece of information, I'm not sure if this is the exact source, but Avatar News references like there being rumors about a prequel Avatar movie. He doesn't cite what that is, but I looked into it and I think the actual source is Grace Randolph and her YouTube channel, and she randomly in a live stream mentioned information about there being an animated Avatar prequel show that has really cool state-of-the-art animation, which lines up with some of the other information we got about Avatar Studios from a while back. Again, she sort of said that like I've been sworn to secrecy on it. I can't like say who it's about. So there's this bit of a tease that like it's sort of exciting who the prequel is actually about. Everyone I think at the chat at that time was thinking Kyoshi straight away. So the first movie potentially is an Avatar prequel. Now, what exactly that means is hard to speculate on, because when I think prequel, I think heavy connection to whatever it's a prequel to, but you can also just use it to refer to it is set before something. So we don't know exactly, but everyone is leaning in the direction of, I think, either Kyoshi to go with the hype, or Wan or early Avatar. That feels like the really, really obvious thing to do. But just with this first one, where we don't have too much information to go on, what are your thoughts on these kind of rumors about one of them being a Avatar prequel?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I mean, I know you said like a couple of those, and those definitely seem to be the standout from what people are saying, but there really is a lot of options that could go with that. I mean, those are the obvious just because of the current hype and what's going on with, the current fandom, which makes, good business sense to me in terms of like, getting something made that's actually going to, make your money back and everything like that. But there is still pretty wide, area there that they can go with. But I do just like the general idea that, really leaves them open to things that we really haven't seen or haven't seen much of. I think that, kind of intrigues me more so than, what the other one is with going with stuff that we already know. So I definitely like that is, an option, an idea. Hopefully it's true. So no, that definitely seems like one that could work out really well, at least in my mind.
Yeah, and I think like this combined with what the other one is kind of exactly what I'd want from some of the early projects of like, okay, address the mainline content that we already have and do continuation content, but yeah, go for like potentially a new Avatar, but go back instead of going forward. Because I think it's always going to be a little bit like, how do you advance things even more than Korra? What way do you want to go about doing that? So that's all there is on that, even though I suppose it's technically the one that now has, I suppose, two people backing the idea that one of them is a prequel, because apparently Avatar News' source has confirmed that this is true. Nothing is said about which one of these is like the first thing in development. Like we don't know if it's the prequel or the other one, which is a Zuko movie, is the first movie, like the first ever piece of Avatar Studios information that we know. But Avatar News' exclusive reveal here is that I can also exclusively reveal the concept of the other movie in development, a Zuko-focused story. That's basically all it really is. Again, he just goes over the fact that he doesn't yet know time period of when it's set, that sort of thing. But he also does say at the end, these are just two of the animated projects in the works, and trust me, there's a lot more exciting stuff where that came from. I'm hoping I can post one particular animated streaming series soon that should make a lot of people happy. So, you know, and he just says it's really early, stuff could have changed, but, you know, it's the first piece of information about things. So we'll get to that in a second, but obviously, big thing here, Zuko movie. This is very interesting. Initially, when I saw this, of course, I just saw Zuko and prequel, and I kind of connected the two, and it was kind of like, no, that's not what I want. Zuko prequel, what are we doing there? But no. This is highly likely to be set somewhere in the gap period between ATLA and Korra. I think you can maybe connect a lot of things together, like the fact that the Avatar comics came to like a screeching halt, right at potentially the time for key Zuko Azula stuff to happen. And I feel this probably will be set somewhere in the sort of post like imbalance, post Smoke and Shadow kind of time period. And this is basically our ATLA movie. It's just that I guess Zuko will be what the plot more revolves around. But I think we're definitely going to see like Aang, Katara, Sokka, like the main cast in this. And I really like the idea that, we know, sort of Mike and Brian want to do new stuff, but that it makes complete sense that they do at least one ATLA project as the kind of potentially the final send-off. Like, here's the last truly significant piece of ATLA content. The rest can be done in like novels, comics, maybe some of the smaller projects. This is the last big thing for Avatar to kind of bridge the gaps between the ATLA stuff in Korra, ATLA itself, and the last big questions I think really are Zuko, Azula, making it clear to a wider audience that, like, say, Ursa is back, and answering all those questions, showing the gang older and stuff like that. That's what I see this kind of being. I can't see this being a prequel Zuko before ATLA. I just don't think the content is there with whatever his journey was. I don't see them doing it like as like Korra era Zuko. So I think this has to be like adult Zuko, like we're talking about Zuko in his 20s, which lines up with what they said in the RPG book about the whole Druk thing. Not that I think it's connected too much, but interesting that it's kind of all happening at once. What are your thoughts on this? A second movie, the ATLA movie potentially being Zuko focused.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what everyone would potentially prefer, at least those who are really sort of invested in the original series, which seems to be a very, vocal group for sure. So I don't know. I mean, the idea that it's going to be, post what we've seen in the comics definitely has a lot of potential, especially with, everything with Republic City and how that factors into the whole overall scheme of the Avatar world. So there's definitely a lot of different stories there. I think, like you said, you would be surprised if, the rest of the gang wasn't there in some capacity. And if this is going to be something that could potentially tie up all of those sort of like loose ends that we've been, wondering for a while now. I think, the runtime, depending on how they do it, definitely gives them the ability to actually go for it. So I think it's definitely, it seems like it could work out really well. It could bring, a lot of people into it, a lot of people who haven't seen the show. Like you said, the whole idea of like catching people up with everything that's happened in the comics, I think is something that, is definitely worth doing in the visual format, since I know a lot of people, listen to this and, some other places, will be aware of that. But, there are plenty of people, and I'm sure you've seen, who, still ask what has happened, or who's Ki, or who is, everyone else who, comes up in any of the comics. So there's definitely, some potential there as well to see, if they do like flashback things or anything like that, which I'm sure some people would be pretty happy to actually see as well, or if they just do, like a verbal dump on that sort of stuff. So there's, a bunch of different ways that they can go about doing that, if that is what they're planning to do. If they were to do a later Zuko, I mean, that could work as well, depending on how they want to go with it. I mean, it definitely would be, way before Korra's time in terms of, the timeline of things. But that's a long time that they have to work with. So it could be any number of things that could happen or could come up during that period of time.
Yeah. I think basically everyone who saw this news was suggesting that this basically either has to be like an adaptation of The Search or the continuation of like the Smoke and Shadow storyline in some way. Basically, I think where Smoke and Shadow leaves off, it feels like, okay, you can do a bit of a time skip after here, reintroduce Azula as being sort of just the menace of the Fire Nation, but then finally commit to, okay, now we're resolving this. Obviously, the big interesting thing with this is that, like, how do you bring people up to speed on the events of The Search, the events of Smoke and Shadow, which would be, like, kind of important to know going in, because if you've just seen the show, you're like, well, Azula was, like, captured, basically, at the end of the show. Ursa was still missing. You have to tell people that stuff, and can you do that in just a quick, like, opening monologue type thing, or do some flashback content that adapts parts of the comics? I think you roughly can. Obviously with The Search, it's kind of a little bit like suddenly, dropping like Mother of Faces stuff and all that sort of content on people who are unaware of it. It's going to be a little bit like crazy, but I think you can do it, and I think this is what you need to do. I think there was no way they weren't going to do some sort of a nostalgia ATLA movie. You needed to do something ATLA related after it being so long, and yeah, I'm excited to see how this all comes together. So I think these two together, like I said earlier, it makes sense to be the first two movies. This way we're getting something new, but in the like era of Avatar that people are hugely interested in, filling in the gap between like Wan and Zito or whatever, and then ATLA directly, like some sort of continuation filling the gap between ATLA and Korra. And it leaves like, okay, we probably want some sort of Korra continuation content. Are we doing more comics, or might one of the other projects be Korra related? Because it is interesting that he does mention here that he's hoping he can like reveal certain exclusive information he has about one of the series that he seems to know about that will make a lot of people happy. So what's that going to be? When I think the fandom nowadays, I tend to think of like, what will people freak out about? It's like, well, Kyoshi tends to be the main thing that is just like universal praise. Mm-hmm. If not, then I'm thinking like ATLA series, but you're doing the movie as ATLA. I don't know. It's hard to fully know, but obviously there's nothing really to speculate on. But what are your thoughts on the fact that there potentially is news about the first show out there as well?
I mean, the fact that they've gotten to the point where that is news that they might be able to share, or that, stuff has already gone on with that, which I think is really good. I mean, like you said, I think it is really early to speculate on what it's actually going to be. I mean, it could be something completely, original that might be interesting. I mean, I don't know if that would generate as much hype, but I think at this point, anything Avatar related generates a good bit of hype, so maybe they're just banking on that. But I do like the idea that, the streaming side of it, which is something that, we've known that is part of their plan with all the other stuff that they have in production, is something that will be really, really cool to see when it actually does come out. So I think that seems interesting, especially, if it's something that could be stringed out over a period of time that could lean into something continually happening, if that is something that they plan to do going forward with everything. So I think it's good news if that's true.
Yeah, and then like if it is, this is maybe one of the, say, spin-off series rather than like main series. Iroh, I think, feels like a good thing. Like Red Lotus backstory, however you structure that into being a like cohesive thing, would be interesting. It's hard to know because obviously, depending on what section of the fandom you look at, people are hugely excited by very, very different things. But definitely like Kyoshi, Iroh, Red Lotus, ATLA, Korra to a degree, they're the things that get people really, really excited these days. So they obviously must know what the most exciting things are to do projects about, and it makes sense, yeah, that this first grouping of things would be like familiar to people, and then you can maybe use like your prequel to introduce new things and go from there. But yeah, it's good to get our first news. I think the obvious question from here is, does this suggest that we might have like the announcements of a couple of these projects happening relatively soon? Like, is this insider information that is actually like super leaked, super secret that we're not meant to know for like a year to 6 months? Or is this like a couple of weeks, couple of months ahead of them actually going ahead to confirm stuff? Because we're getting to like a year and a half post Avatar Studios announcement, so we kind of need to know some of this stuff. There's only so long we can have the kind of fandom be the way it's been the last year and a bit. So do you think this maybe gives more hope for like SDCC, NYCC having some sort of a early announcement of this is at least one of these movies?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't put a lot of stock into that, just because it seems like this is like, this seems, and there's like one other place where it seems like we're getting this sort of like pseudo official, unofficial news, which again, who knows when they'll set up their channels and stuff to like actually produce, the real official, Avatar Studio news and all of that. So I don't know. It's kind of a bit hard to gauge with everything, and everything just says soon. So I don't know. I mean, it still feels like there's like year plus time in terms of like production and stuff like that. So I wouldn't particularly be feeling that there would be anything coming, quite that soon in terms of like seeing something like visually done, other than, maybe some early like, concepts or, sort of the title stuff that we've always been talking about before. Maybe along those lines would be the most that I would think would actually happen.
Yeah, I think they just need to say something more than like their like very disappointing like appearance on the Breaking the Elements podcast, where they're still just saying nothing. Just so that when like there are interviews, we can talk about like, oh yeah, the Zuko movie. Like we can just be clear about like the first thing is the Zuko movie. Like, does it need to be that secretive? It's okay if it's still like a year or two away, but like, can we know about it? Just so we can confirm that in terms of speculation. But yeah, that is all of the news that we have at the moment. Beyond that, in terms of like what maybe we're expecting, it's just under 2 months until the Yang Chen book comes out. So again, we're waiting for like our first excerpt of that. Hopefully that maybe happens in the next couple of weeks. August for the Chibi book, so that probably means like, yeah, next month for like the preview pages for that. But because we already have the free comic book day preview, the ones that we get this early on are not going to be new, I would guess. And new pages from that probably won't be until the Google preview comes out much closer to the release. Obviously with the Paddington Time being delayed into October, that means we're not expecting preview pages of that until like August. So it feels like it's sort of like SDCC, if anything happens. It's basically like July, I think, more or less what we're waiting for any potential Avatar Studios news, and that's basically in or around the time the Yang Chen book is going to be coming out. So they're the things that are sort of immediately on the horizon. Otherwise, we're just waiting for announcements. So we will move on to do our reviews for this episode. So we're going to start with the Korra episode this time out, and that is K104, The Voice in the Night. So this, I think, is a really, really good episode. I really loved going back to watch this one again. I love, especially on the Korra side of things, how focused it is. It's just trying to do this character arc, this character beat with Korra about fear. And it really works to give you extra nuance to the character who you maybe haven't gone into that nuance just yet. And this is exactly, I think, what they needed to do throughout the episode, was to, do something to sort of calm her down a little bit from the always want to take action character. And so immediately you get this idea of she's afraid because of what happened in the last episode, and that I think makes for a very interesting Korra over the course of the episode. The rest of it is still introductory. We get a few key characters introduced here, but the Korra stuff actually developing things, I think, makes this a really strong episode. But overall, what are your thoughts on The Voice in the Night?
Yeah, I would agree that this episode does a pretty good job of sort of grounding Korra in sort of the more realities of what's actually happening in Republic City, and it's a lot more, introspective for her and her own personal feelings, and coming into beginning to more so understand what the Avatar might actually be held responsible for doing, and how she might not necessarily be quite ready for everything that entails at this point in time. So it's sort of really putting it in her face how the city actually works, and actually more developing sort of the politics side of the public city, and how Tenzin's actually involved with everything.
So yeah, getting into some specifics here, I'll actually start us off with the introduction of Asami. So we're 4 episodes in here, and we finally get our kind of last kind of Team Avatar member here. She literally crashes into Mako to kind of enter the series. Immediately we get some romance stuff here, setting up the Masami relationship. Through her we get the reveal of her father Hiroshi, who ends up being quite important. But for now, it's not really too much of a tease with either of them or anything going on. It's just, here's Asami, here's her father, who, basically kind of self-made for the most part, got a loan and managed to be quite successful, despite being a non-bender. Some of the backstory stuff comes up with, like, this, we get the whole idea of she lost her mother. The details aren't presented just yet. Somewhat similar to Mako's backstory. But interestingly, you do get that Asami actually is super into pro bending. She sort of recognizes Mako, reveals that she's actually watched all the matches, and we sort of just end this plot point with Hiroshi is going to sponsor the Fire Ferret. So the plot point from the last episode gets more or less resolved here with this sponsorship deal through Mako's relationship with Asami. And so this is the birth basically of the future industry's Fire Ferrets. It's nice. I don't think it's this stunning introduction for Asami as a character, because I think she has better episodes later on in the season where we get to see, I suppose, more aspects of that. But it's, I think, pretty solid opening for Asami. So what are your thoughts on one of our main characters being introduced here?
Yeah, for her character introduction, I mean, I guess it could kind of feel like it's sort of sort of surface level, sort of integrating her into the group through one of the other main characters that we already have established from the previous 3 episodes. So it does a good job of at least, alerting her to the other characters, and we get to see sort of the dynamics and the sort of early relationship that she has with Mako here, and how that all blooms, and how that like you said, essentially solves their previous episode's issue in terms of how they're actually going to compete in the actual tournament here. So I don't know, I think it works for her character. I mean, there's a lot that they could do with it, but I think a lot of it is purposefully sort of ambiguous, considering how her character could have ended up later on. But it is interesting to look back at it now to see how they introduced her, how Hiroshi came into the whole play of things, knowing where he actually ends up in the end and everything, how he plays his initial role of being sort of the magnanimous sort of billionaire philanthropist type of character pretty well. So you really don't really know what his sort of end goals actually are. I think they did a pretty good job in that regard of not making him seem, somewhat scary, or, have super alternative motives or anything like that. So I think, the introduction of both of them and Asami, joining into the group, works pretty well. She doesn't have a lot of interactions with Korra or anything like that. It's really only one moment at the ball or anything like that. So, we can see how, there might be some issues there, but there's not much of that because that's not really what Korra is focused on in this episode.
And Asami is one of the characters I'm very interested to sort of focus in on as we go through this rewatch, just because she's always been, I think, for me, like of the main four characters, definitely the one who has like the least amount of focus. She has the least amount of like character arcs across the episodes. And so it is interesting to look back on this and be like, yeah, Hiroshi does sort of come across as being a bit more interesting just from this first episode. And obviously, like, we know we're heading to like episode 7 is the big one. That's like the best Asami episode. But is there kind of more to her than that? Because like it's just the first episode, like so it is ultimately fine what we get here. And with regards to where we're eventually heading and the whole idea of she makes the decision to side with her friends over the one remaining member of her family, Hiroshi. She sides with these people over like the wealth here from this important family also, that she's into pro bending. She is perfectly fine with asking Mako out on a date, and especially the scene on like their third date where she says like she feels safe with Mako feels very like, okay, so like you basically get the idea that Hiroshi has raised Asami not at all trying to force his opinions on being anti-bender on her, because she doesn't really have that at all, because of how they do that here. So I think that's some of the stuff that does stand out kind of a little bit, in that she feels safe being on a date with a firebender, even though like a firebender killed her mother. That's interesting, whereas Hiroshi, as we get in the later episodes, basically can't bring himself to do this and is actually acting this whole time and kind of, I forget the dialogue that he says later on, but like hates the fact that all this stuff is happening while he's undercover here. So it's interesting. Like a lot of Asami stuff is ultimately related to her father, and even in the comics we're still waiting for just a little bit of more of her to come out a bit more. And that's why you maybe wish that, like, okay, they're not going to give us the backstories in like animation of Mako and Bolin, what happened to their parents or what happened to Asami. But I kind of do feel we maybe should have got something with Yasuko to show some of the relationship there. That's maybe a little bit of a missed opportunity. But I suppose while we're still on Asami, what were your thoughts on how they did the basically 3 date scenes here with Mako and Asami to set up their relationship here? So they have the first one at Kwong's. Their second one is effectively the gala, even though we don't focus on them. And then the third one is like the carriage ride through the park. How do you think they did this relationship? And does Masami stand out at all to you as being a memorable ship from the show?
That's a good question. I think for a lot of people, I guess it stands out just because of the whole, sort of tribe relationship and how that sort of ended up being in the end. So I think a lot of people, oh, that is a good point. I wonder. I mean, it definitely, I definitely recall it being, a thing initially, just because, they clearly, focus on that actually, being a potential thing, and her being such a fan of pro bending. Like, it almost seems like that's like a perfect case scenario. So, I like it from that regard, that it seems like it would fit everything here. When you find out how it plays on later on with, their relationship and, with the Hiroshi and his whole hate for just benders in general, then it kind of makes you sort of wonder a bit more of how well it actually plays out in the grand scheme of things. But I think in this isolated episode, it doesn't come off to me as being like super weird or super awkward like that. Like, it doesn't, I don't think it feels that forced, as opposed to some other times where it might feel like it goes like a little bit too fast. So no, I think, I recall it. It doesn't, bother me or anything like that, but it doesn't, do much for the future, other than just that he's been involved with all of them.
Mm. Yeah, like I think it's fine. I do think the Mako Asami relationship has always felt like, to me, one of the weaker, like, main kind of canon relationships that they've kind of went for. especially because they kind of go back to it a little bit in book 2, very, very randomly. And again, it's just that sort of situation where Mako and Asami, especially because so much of their interactions was like straight away into romance, I kind of feel like I want more just the two of them interacting with each other to see what their dynamic is. Whereas Mako Korra, even though there's drama, relationship stuff involved as well, we have enough scenes of them like interacting normally before that where their dynamic comes across a little bit better. So it is unfortunately, I think, another thing in the category of the writers not quite being sure how to use Asami in quite a lot of situations. But I don't think we're in like by any means the worst of it yet. Like book 1 is one of Asami's best books, and I'm actually really excited to get to episode 7 because it's a really good episode. But you know, it's fine here, and there are little moments that I do like the voice acting performance from Seychelle Gabrielle is very good, and of course, you know, she's got one of the most attractive character designs in the series, so you know, it's a good intro for this character. But what's the next thing you want to talk about for this episode?
So since we were already sort of talking about sort of the party here, I want to go more into sort of the politics side of this episode, since that's something that we see a lot here with Tarlok and the whole idea of creating this task force in response to the whole equalist movement here, and of course how eventually Korra actually gets roped into that.
Yeah, so yeah, this is also Tarlok's introduction as well, one of our villains, though I suppose right now we don't fully know it, and we're with him you just get that like he's a little bit shady, the fact of like how he manipulated Korra in the end.
Yeah.
He went from being like, oh, join because I know this is your personality, to I'll send you gifts. No, okay, I can see that you're a little bit prideful. Here you are in front of the press to manipulate her. And I love the dynamic between Tarlok and Korra over the course of the series, because it is very like antagonistic towards each other. Like they interact quite a lot, and while there are aspects of it where you see when they're on the task force where they actually work well together, the second like he breaks Korra's trust, it's clear that these two just do not like each other. And episode 8 is obviously fantastic at showing that, and we'll get to it. But for now, it's like, yeah, it's Tarlok trying to politic his way into more position. This is the first episode, I suppose, where we get a good look at the Republic City Council, and we see like it's Tenzin as like the main opposition, Tarlok, who most of the people tend to agree with, and then the rest of them are just sort of there, and it doesn't feel like they have too much, going on as such, in that it's Tarlok is able to manipulate them and get most of what he wants. And even though Tenzin is actually he's the one who typically has the solid take on the situation, Tarlok ends up kind of getting what he wants. And you know, it speaks to the idea of like one of the problems that they end up solving is that this is a council of all benders, so their views on the bender non-bender issue isn't fantastic. But it does seem like the problem is just more that they have a few weak leaders rather than necessarily that they're all benders, because Tenzin tries to kind of argue the point that this won't go down well, creating a task force against the Equalists, given that they have a point. But he's unable to make much of a kind of inroads into the others because they just agree with the idea of, oh, people are causing chaos in the city, we need to stop them. So I suppose while we're here, what were your thoughts on the council scene and how, you know, Tenzin is on the council, Tarlok's position on it, and the other three?
Yeah, I mean, the other three, like you said, it doesn't really seem like, I mean, I guess, it might be hard to sort of like write some sort of like, mini story to sort of their positions there and sort of how they factor into things, even though I think that might have actually been nice, even though I know not everyone likes sort of the more politics side of core, but I think that might have fleshed out a little bit of things in terms of like how the city is really sort of run. Granted, I like Tarlock. I like how, they have him as sort of this antagonistic character towards Core, and, eventually she breaks the trust. You do have that awesome episode, like you mentioned. So I don't know. The idea of the console it's interesting. It's something that we, don't necessarily, have gotten a lot in previous, in the previous, show for Avatar. So the idea that this is how the city is run, is intriguing, and of course eventually it leads to change in the president and everything like that. So it definitely has its place in terms of like showing its faults, but the idea of it here is cool. I like Tenzin being sort of the voice of reason here. It seems like that would be like the perfect case for the air air nomad person to actually have that, even though I guess in the grand scheme of things maybe that doesn't seem I don't know, the sway that person might have in terms of like, having a nation to back him, understandably at this point in time is relatively weak because there aren't many airbenders at all in the world. So, that, sometimes that kind of makes you wonder in terms of that regard. But, the idea that Tarlock is sort of politicking his way in terms of like getting what he wants, is a nice aspect of this show or this season.
Yeah, because what becomes clear from this scene is that like similar situations have played out like over and over again with Tarlock and the council. He is pretty much like he always gets his way. This is why Tenzin is suspicious of him, because he keeps moving and getting what he wants, and Tenzin tends to be in opposition to that. So the scene when he just turns up on the island, it's like perfect characterization of like he just walks into Tenzin's house because he knows enough about air nomad culture that they won't turn him away. That would look bad to do that, even though Tenzin wants to, probably should. And this scene's great because it's obviously him introducing himself to Korra, because he wants Korra on the task force because it would look good in terms of PR. And that's a key part of like episode 8 is like the kind of public relations battle that they kind of almost have. And he wants to get across the idea that we are going against the Equalists, we are stopping them, because Tarlock's position ends up being he is so against the Equalists that he effectively is more or less the position of like anti-non-bender, basically. He basically paints them all as being Equalist, even though most non-benders are not like them. Now, of course, you have to reference the episode 3 scene and the amount of people at the Revelation meeting that Korra and Mako went to. So it is a deep-seated issue, but there's a lot of people who are non-benders who aren't part of this group, which is, going to perform terrorist acts coming up shortly. So I suppose while we're here, what are your thoughts on Tarlock and like what his like political position actually is here in terms of does he just go to extremes, referencing that episode, by kind of coming across anti-non-bender, or is he actually anti-non-bender?
That's a good point there. I think I mean, when he does go to the extremes, as the episode does, it definitely seems like he's almost bridged that gap, because he's not really considering non-benders at all at that point, which is probably just a fault of sort of his upbringing and everything that else is going on with him as a character. So there's a lot into that. I mean, it almost makes sense in terms of him versus Amon, that he would be on the other opposite side of the spectrum here, but it doesn't seem like he's directly targeting them from the get-go. So that's where I would say that maybe he's not specifically against all non-benders in that regard, because it doesn't seem, from this episode, it doesn't seem like that's his particular goal. Like his real goal in here is to sort of capture anyone who's training to be equalist and, eventually get to Amon. And, he even, mentions that he doesn't want Korra to sort of like confront him, face to face when they do have that confrontation later on in the episode. So from there, it almost seems like he does have, some general sense in himself, at least until he just gets enraged and then he's just off the rails at that point.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely comes across as just like he is kind of like Korra. He's driven to take action, and like Tenzin's opposition to Tarlok is not that like you're wrong to want to shut this down. It's just you're maybe rushing into it with like a full-on task force, which is basically like a extra military wing almost. That's a bit too much, and that's Tenzin's opposition. So there's that comparison as well. That like yeah, he just lets things get out of control to the point where he basically ends up being anti non-bender. But it is interesting, like you referenced their backstories, and that you'd think coming out of it that Tarlok would be maybe more inclined to go down the road of being a little bit more thoughtful about like non-benders, and that Noatok would be maybe the one to go down the more like bender supremacy route. So it's interesting that they actually end up on like opposite sides, that the character who was ultimately entranced by power, the power of bloodbending, the power of the Avatar, is the one who joins the non-bender group, and then Tarlok, who was the kind of nice one who didn't want to lean into the super powerful ability that they had, he's actually the one who ends up going about things in that way. But that's like the whole tragedy of this family, and that they inadvertently go down the same road as their father, just from slightly like different like perspectives. That Tarlok is taking over the city legally, technically. One of them does it via terrorism, one of them does it as like a gangster. It's very interesting. But the scene on Air Temple Island, I love Iki throughout the whole thing, because it's like she knows, she can like see somehow through everything with Tarlok, and knows that this guy is no good. Somehow she just like, she can't put it into words, but like, no, something's up with this guy. Even though it's more humor here, I love the scene where she just like, he's talking to Korra and she's just staring at him the whole time, and they just keep on that face. It's really fantastic, and it sort of fits with sort of Iki's personality in that she actually does, she is able to sort of like kind of see the truth of people in a way, based on other scenes like in book 4 and so on. But what were your thoughts on the Tarlok Air Temple Island scene?
Yeah, no, that all the parts with Iki is really good. She really does a good job in terms of just like being that character who's sort of like, like they can be annoying, but they're like more like introspective annoying, because they can sort of like understand what's going on, rather than like Milo, who's just sort of like all over the place in terms of his responses most of the time. But yeah, that seems definitely interesting. I mean, you do, learn a little bit about air nomad culture. You get to see him interact with Tenzin in his home. You get to see sort of like a angry Penma as well. So, there's a lot going on in that scene, and, Korra's response initially, to everything, kind of throws them all for a loop there, because they expected her to be a bit more active in this endeavor here. But you can definitely see, especially from the earlier scene with the dream, that she's really not sort of, at least initially, up to this task that he's proposing here. And of course that eventually, like you mentioned earlier, just leads to more and more extravagant gifts to actually get her, until he gets her into a corner to join the actual task force.
Yeah. Korra's decision here is fantastic, because you completely, after the first 3 episodes, expect Korra to be like, yes, 100% yes. She gets to, if she joins the task force, effectively legally do what she did in episode 1 with the triads. Like, that's what she wants to do. That seems to be her character. She gets to fight, which is what she's been all about, be active on a task force, taking out the enemy. But she says no, and then brings up the excuses, which are the excuses Tenzin wants, but I like that Tenzin sort of sees through this straight away. Highlighting that again, that like Tenzin, is not the ideal like teacher for Korra necessarily, but he is this good mentor in a way, that where they eventually get to at the end of book 2 is they're at their best when, Tenzin is looking out for Korra helps Tenzin, when there's too much of a dynamic where like it's master and apprentice type thing, that tends to be maybe where some of the issues come in. But I like that Tenzin can just see through this and be like, oh, like I want this. This is good, Korra, but have you made this decision for the right reasons? And so the Tenzin Korra stuff throughout this episode is also fantastic, which we'll get to. But for now, what do I want to talk about? Yeah, there's not too much Tarlok for the rest of this. The main thing, like I mentioned earlier on, is just that at the gala, he does sort of just throw her out in front of the media. And it's clear that he's, I suppose, planted the questions and the idea of what he wants them to ask. And he could see, based on the way Korra acted, that, oh, I can get her this way by playing on this idea that she's dealing with fear and she's not used to that. What if the media just call her out as being afraid of Amon? And that gets her to join here. And I like it because we've seen that like Korra doesn't have like media training or anything like that. She's been okay in the scenes where she's had to do a speech here and there so far. But she does just get caught up in the emotion of this situation and agrees to join the task force here. And again, it's a good scene because it sets up a lot of the back and forth, you know, I do this in front of the press, you do this in front of the press in episode 8, which we eventually get to. But it's nice because like there's a little bit of an arc about just like Korra with the media where she is eventually able to give a really good speech at like the end of like book 2 and so on, that you can see she becomes a better leader, world leader character, able to give the good speeches as well. Whereas like Amon, who we also see speak a lot in this episode, speeches, is an amazing like orator, but Korra isn't just yet. So what were your thoughts on that sort of key middle scene in the episode of Tarlok throwing Korra to the media?
Yeah, throwing her to the wolves there. Yeah, I mean, Korra, like we've mentioned, she's, lived relatively, sheltered life up to this point. So yeah, she's like essentially, a master bender in 3 out of the 4 elements at this point. But it doesn't mean that she actually, has a lot of interactions with people, especially not on this sort of scale. And, sort of her core personality comes out at this point where she's sort of forced to make a decision in terms of, rebuttaling, all of these reporters, which, you can see, Tenzin's like, he can see sort of what's happened, which, makes sense because he's been in this arena a little bit more and, he's worked with Tarlok. So, of course, he knows what Tarlok's trying to go for. It almost seems like, he was distracted by his family at this event, so he couldn't necessarily be there with her at all this point in terms of like telling her how to handle the media directly. So, it's one of those, I guess, growing pains for Korra as a character, but, like you said, it comes throughout the whole seasons where they talk about like, her ratings and how the media and the public is perceiving her. So there's a lot to that, and even that goes into some of the other comic stuff as well. So it's interesting to see how that, begins here with her and eventually how she's actually, trying to get some good press. Get to see her in the newspapers a couple of times, and that, sort of, I guess you could say, like emboldens her a little bit because she's had like a little bit of success here, being on the task force and surprisingly, working well with Tarlok in sort of the more combat situations here, which, I think Korra would work well in combat with pretty much anyone who's like of competent level. So I guess that might not be too surprising as far as that goes, but it does eventually lead to her downfall.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The episode's mostly about like Korra dealing with her fear, but the questions the media ask her do get across like just I suppose the pressure that she's under as the Avatar, just full stop, and that they're like, oh, you've done pro bending. Is that going to get in the way of you like performing your Avatar actions to deal with this, and this? And it's like this sort of realization of like, oh, do I not get to like do things for myself? I just have to at all times be just out there being the hero for the city, and is she ready for that yet? That definitely kind of begins to come up here, and here she's kind of forced into that. So You get that, like, there's a slight sense of like, oh, she hasn't been at the pro bending practices recently, so she's sort of struggling to deal with like all these things she's like agreed to do as well. So that's another pressure on top of the fear, and it all adds up towards the final scene here. But what's the next thing in this episode you want to talk about?
Um, let's see. Next thing that I want to talk about in this one. I mean, I guess we could talk a little bit about just sort of the whole idea of the pro betting and just sort of how they eventually get that resolved really quick. But I guess it's more just in terms of how I guess Cora's feeling about all this in general, how she's pretty much just stalled at this point. Like, you get to see a few glimpses of it here. We get to talk down with, Tenzin. He notices right off the bat, like you mentioned earlier, but he does try to talk to her directly until, even when she does have the actual confrontation with Amon. Even after that, that's like when she finally sort of admits it, but just her sort of, I guess, mental state in general.
Yeah, the way the episode does this is, I think, really nicely done. Like the opening scene of like the nightmare about being attacked happening straight after what she saw at the revelation with Amon's abilities, and she effectively has a nightmare about being captured and getting her bending taken by Amon. So straight away you get the idea she's afraid of that. She's afraid of that ability. We saw that in the last episode. Then you get this very interesting scene with Bolin, who comes up, gives Korra a gift, and it's not really romantic here. It's just Bolin honestly thanks Korra for saving him, and effectively is like, "Oh, I was such a coward in that scene. You were so brave and amazing." Not realizing that Korra is now like terrified of this. She was able to act and fight in that scene, but she's terrified of what's happening here, and she's just that contrast of like Bolin, who can so openly like admit that he was like absolutely terrified, and Korra not being able to say it out loud. That was really nice, because like Bolin gets like a subtle arc in book one, which is effectively him getting over his fear and like, I suppose, being able to be a hero, being able to fight when the time comes. Like he charges into battle on Naga in the last episode. That's like his kind of arc, basically. So I like that. And then, like you said, we get the Tenzin scene where it's like, it's okay to be scared, talk about our fears, and notably he says like they can throw us out of balance. So this is a concept that kind of gets brought up every so often, like Zuko in the Earth King, Lin in Old Wounds, I believe it is. Just this idea of like, yeah, when you're afraid to deal with something and all that sort of stuff, it can affect you in other ways, and in Avatar actually physically as well. So I did appreciate that getting brought up. But it builds up, of course, to the big scene right at the end. Korra breaking down in tears in Tenzin's arms, and admitting she's afraid, which is the obvious thing. She admits like she was helpless in front of Amon. But I think the big one is actually just her admitting that she doesn't know what to do. It's that she's like overwhelmed by like everything that's going on here. That the first episode was her seeing everything that's wrong. Here's her kind of realizing that I'm here, I want to help, but I actually have no idea what it is that I need to do. And that's what's actually kind of, I suppose, so significant about like the next episode being a little bit more of a cool down. It's an episode people tend to not like because of all the other stuff, but Korra needs to calm down after what's happened in this episode. And with the idea of like admitting your fears is the most difficult step, and it will go better from here. So, Tenzin being there for Korra is definitely like the best part of like their relationship in these early days. So I just really loved how they did this, especially that Bolin scene. But what are your thoughts on the main arc for this episode? Korra dealing with her fears and then just not knowing what to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult situation that she's been placed in here, and it's one that she, hasn't really been trained for in any sort of regard. Like, she can fight and do all of that, but this is, a lot more involved and has a lot of different pieces, and she's only just arrived at the city here, so, it's a bit understandable that she wouldn't quite know what to do. Also, the fact that she's seeing what this person can do in person, and has just had a confrontation with them that could have left her without her bending to some degree. So it's definitely understandable that she's going through this, and the fact that they're making it a point to show us that she isn't quite confident in everything that she's doing. Like, even when she does actually, uh, is on the task force and is actually, confronting the trainers or the training people for the Equalists, like, you can see her, like, have a bit of a shock there when she actually, right before they actually start the attack there. So even when she's diving in head first, she still has some hesitation towards what she actually has to do here, and at the end she finally is able to admit that, which is what Tenzin was trying to get across from the beginning here.
Yeah. And I suppose on the subject of like her just not knowing what to do, like that's the other aspect of like the way her training ended up going, is that she doesn't even know how to be the Avatar, what exactly the Avatar is like meant or expected to do. And this sort of continues into like book 2, where like they reveal, of course, that like she is not being told about like key events happening around the world that she should be getting involved in and being dealt with. So it's one of those things where like, yeah, like she doesn't know what specifically she has to do, and it goes back to a lot of the stuff like, well, okay, if I join the task force I can do this, but if I'm not part of the task force I'm technically not allowed to do anything because you'll get in trouble with Lin in the first episode. So it's just kind of like, where exactly is the Avatar in the scale of all of these things, where like the media expects her to be involved in everything, but she can't be. So it's an interesting one to just deal with a lot of that pressure. And I think that leaves just some of the action stuff here that we get. So there's only 2 main action scenes. It's the raid on the chi blocking training facility, which is actually quite interesting because we get a bunch of brutal takedowns by benders on non-benders. Some of these chi blockers get absolutely like wrecked in this this raid. Especially some of the earthbending maneuvers. It feels like you've killed some people here. Like someone gets like absolutely fired into a wall. Someone gets a slab of earth slammed into the wall. Even the sudden water bending to like ice people's heads and like slam them into the ground. It gets across like it was a raid, like they were taken completely by surprise. But it's like, okay, cool, it makes sense. Take down the potential of what these Equalists are maybe planning to do, but it also is not really helping the kind of like the benders are oppressing us sort of situation with how brutal this actually looked. So what were your thoughts on the chi blocking raid?
Yeah, I mean, as the action sequence is pretty cool to see. I mean, it definitely flows well and everything like that. And I like, just the speed at which they're going for it. I think that all worked pretty well. It definitely, I definitely get your point that it definitely seems like a lot of people, probably are pretty, injured at this point here, which I guess, that's kind of how it goes in these sort of raids. So, this is just sort of the Bender equivalent of these sort of situations here. But I don't know. I think it plays out well. You can see a little bit of how Korra and Tarlok can work together, as we've mentioned before. Just interesting that there was, at least 1 or 2, Equalists that were like already sort of like suited up, unless they just changed really fast when they escaped through the door or something like that. So, that's interesting to note that they seem to have that sort of setup there. But, just the idea that they're training in this sort of secret location is really sort of like intriguing towards, the whole show overall. So I definitely like the idea of what it sort of adds to the series overall. Just sort of, seeing this sort of bit of action here, I think is neat.
Yeah, like what ends up getting, I suppose, revealed in like episode 6, I think it is, the idea that like Amon is trying to like make this technology that allows non-benders to match benders more prevalent, as well as the skills that you can also use to take on benders. It's an interesting point, and that like, yeah, he needs his group, which is all non-benders, to actually be able to defeat benders. So he's training up everyone in G-blocking. The technology will come in later, as we'll see. It's good setup. And then the last scene I think that's important is obviously the scene where Korra goes to confront Amon. She actually challenges him to a duel. She's left waiting, and just when she lets her guard down, that's when they strike. It's not really much of a fight, you know. She hits a few people, but ultimately she's completely surrounded. It's basically meant to be her nightmare coming true. It's kind of framed in that sort of similar way. Amon confronts her. He basically can take her bending away if he wants, but he chooses not to here. He basically says that, it's a little early, more or less saying that, like, it will cause more issues for me if I do this now, when I can easily just do this later. Effectively, I think it's because he needs to build up the Equalists more before he's ready to strike, and that if he took out the Avatar now, all the Benders would come after him, and he actually might be defeated. So he has to leave Korra for now, but doing this arguably has a bigger impact than actually taking it away, because he just proved that I could have done this, and just because the timing isn't right, that's the only reason I'm not doing this. So interesting just that, you get straight away Amon is a more thoughtful villain. He doesn't take this opportunity just because he has it. He thinks it through. So what are your thoughts on this big scene?
Yeah, no, the fact that he, seems to have this master plan in mind, I think that's like almost just as scary as the fact that he really could have taken away her bending at this point. And, it definitely takes Korra quite a while to sort of recover from this confrontation. But, this is like her actually being able to like realize that, that's going to be an issue. So it does have, that sort of, beginning, healing process, if you want to consider that at this point in time. But yeah, it's definitely a pretty like, intense scene, the way that they have it staged here, because they really do sort of like just focus on that she's pretty much surrounded at this point. Like you said, like she does do a couple attacks, but she's really like panicked at this time, because like I'm sure if she had more of like a level head here, she probably could have done some effect that would have pushed the group away from her. But clearly she's not in her right mind right now, and she's panicking. So that all plays into sort of how the Equalists, is still fair and everyone in the whole city.
So Amon does knock Korra out here, which triggers our first look at one of the Yukon flashbacks. So this is really cool, because this was like pure hype at the time for the fandom, because there was a slight sense we're like, okay, cool, Korra's good so far, but there's a disappointment about we found out that some of the characters aren't alive anymore, and we're likely not going to get to see them too much. And so suddenly, like, older Aang, older Sokka, older Toph, and then some incident going on. This is crazy hype. And obviously reflecting on this now, we know that, okay, this is the Yukon flashback. This is what Tarlok actually references earlier on in the episode, the whole event that happened 42 years ago that Aang wasn't afraid to act on. So it's cool that we get that sort of connection here, that like they actually tell you a little bit of information on this event at the start of the episode. We'll obviously cover this when we get to it properly in episode 9, but just from a kind of history kind of point of view, it's notable that this is the first time we see it, and everyone was freaking out, just trying to figure out, what does this event mean? Why is Korra getting it now as like her first ever like past Avatar connection thing? People were really, really going crazy and freaking out about this one, especially because like as the mysteries begin to build up on top of each other, and it takes a while for this one to get resolved. It's like a lot of people had a lot of theories. So what are your thoughts on this? And do you remember your initial reaction to this first flashback?
Yeah, no, there was a lot of intrigue, a lot of hype behind this. For people who, especially when this, first came out, a lot of people were still, referencing the original series and had a lot of, nostalgia baked in for that, and not necessarily for this one because it's clearly just starting. So I think that added a lot to it in terms of, making that seem maybe more important than it really was at the time. I think, when you get to the later, the more drawn out full versions of those flashbacks, I think that definitely, has a lot more going for it. But it is, cool to see it now and to think back on, how much, noise that generated at the time, which I guess, looking at it now, we understand it a bit better, of course, so it doesn't quite have the same effect, but it still is pretty cool to see, and the whole idea of them sort of like transitioning that into actual, Tenzin arriving is also cool as well. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely pretty cool, especially since at this time, like, we didn't have, like, any of the other sort of, like, media type stuff that we have on, like, any of the, like, what happens afterwards or anything like that. So the fact that we can see it, the first time, I think really worked pretty well. I think, that's something that sometimes we would have wondered or would have liked them to do more of, some of the flashback stuff.
Yeah. So this ends up sort of being like it's Aang trying to get this information through to Korra, which, as we've learned from like the Kyoshi novels and stuff like that, is this aspect of like when you haven't connected with a past avatar before, they kind of always have to like force it through. So that's why it comes through at these moments when Korra gets like knocked out, when she doesn't have like any sort of anything in the way to block it coming through. So there's a nice connection to that in terms of like, okay, yeah, the past life trying to be the one to create the connection. But that's 104. Really, really strong episode, as all the core episodes so far have been. And we'll move into Avatar 104, The Warriors of Kyoshi, which is a really interesting episode to look back on now, as how much of the fandom is like focused on Kyoshi related stuff, how, especially in the last couple of years, Suki has become a super, super popular character that people want more of. And here is the kind of start of a lot of this stuff here. What is interesting about the episode is that there's obviously some of those connections which are nice. It is the intro of Suki. We get a tiny bit of Kyoshi stuff, but it's not actually particularly Kyoshi focused here, obviously. That stuff happens later on. Otherwise, it's a relatively standard sort of middle of the road book one episode. Like the main Aang plot of like the jealousy impressing Katara is, it's solid, but it's nothing like crazy. The standout is definitely the Sokka Suki stuff, and then some of the action towards the end. It's very interesting to go from like the Korra episode 4, where like I feel like we need to discuss every single scene, to this one where it feels like, okay, there's a couple of scenes we need to discuss, but we can actually glance past like a lot of it. There's a clear difference between sort of, the very compressed Korra episode where they have to get all of this information across, versus the Avatar episode where they've got time to just relax on this island for a little bit. So this is where the contrast between the episodes is actually very, very interesting, in that it's cool to note a lot of the connections to new material, but it's maybe not one of the stronger episodes overall. But what are your thoughts on the Warriors of Kyoshi?
Yeah, no, I definitely get the idea of that this, in the grander scheme of things, doesn't, other than the fact that it introduces us to, new and key characters, the actual content of this episode, can be kind of breezed over, or, maybe could have even been, sort of integrated into other episodes later on. So, when we're talking about, how they're adapting this and stuff like that, it'll be interesting to note, how much of this plays a focus in things. But, I mean, I think the episode itself is fine. Like you said, Sokka is definitely the focus here. I think in terms of, like, characterizations of our main characters here, I think this is probably one that you really need to see just to not think that Sokka's going to be like a jerk for the whole series, because he does, have like a good arc in this one of actually realizing things. Because I think, for the first 3, if you only watch those, then you might not, want to continue just based off of this character being, the way that he is initially portrayed. So, that's something to consider in this episode. But Yeah, other than that, there's only so much that you can take from this, especially since there are other episodes later on that, have a lot more intrigue in terms of Kyoshi, even if some of those episodes themselves are kind of like, not as important to the grand scheme of things. But they just have more information, lore in them that you learn about. So it's kind of weird. It's not as much in here, but you don't learn as much about the lore. But some of the other lore episodes have more in there, but there's not actually much in the actual episode that means anything to the whole overall series.
Mm-hmm. So, well, actually, let's start with just Kyoshi. Like, what this episode actually says about Kyoshi is literally just that she is a past avatar. Oyaji says she was born 400 years ago, and that's basically it. Like, they don't clarify that this is like the avatar before Roku, that's like 2 before Aang. That's really all we get. They don't say like a lot of things about how, like, obviously they don't reveal yet that Kyoshi turned it from a peninsula into an island. They don't tell you a lot of the other details that you find out later about Kyoshi, about like, you don't really get the sense for how tall or imposing she necessarily is. Apart from the visual connection, do they even say in this episode that like the Kyoshi warriors are like inherently like linked to Kyoshi outside of the look? I don't think there's dialogue that directly says that. You're just meant to be like, okay, well, Kyoshi warriors on Kyoshi Island, they had a statue of Kyoshi, there's the connection. It's a lot of extra stuff later on that makes a lot of these clear-cut connections. One thing that does come across, though, is that I think you do roughly get the sense that this place is sort of isolationist. The mere fact that our hero characters just arrive on the island and get captured by the locals probably tells you that they don't like having other people arrive in. And this is where, like, in reflection, if they had the Suki alone content in mind at this point, you probably would have got that across in the dialogue, that they reveal that this place is isolationist because of something Kyoshi had said. You probably would use some of the Suki backstory from Suki alone to develop her a little bit more at this point. But that's the point with Suki as well, is that the reason she doesn't come back for like 30 more episodes is because there's your sort of like production timeline of like them being able to react to the fact that people actually like the character of Suki and realizing that they should put her back into the show. Because that's why she comes back. People like this episode. So there's so many interesting things about how it doesn't really give you too much else. Oyaji says Kyoshi, like as in the island, has stayed out of the war so far. And this is obviously what they based the whole Suki Mingjia plot from Suki Alone on. So there's little pieces like that that are kind of cool. I suppose we'll get into the Suki Alone connection discussion a little bit later on. But what were your thoughts looking back on this episode from the perspective of, like, we know Suki so much more now, and we have so much more information about Kyoshi herself?
Yeah, I thought that was definitely something to keep in mind, and I'm sure we'll mention it later on as well as we go through other episodes. But just the fact that they're on this island, that they, like you said, they seem like they're isolated, like they don't really, want to deal with outsiders, mainly because of the war. Which, in terms of the war, that's like pretty understandable. But you don't really, just watching this episode, you don't understand the whole history of this island. Like, you don't really, know what's happened in the past here. So, just seeing it on, first look here, you just see a bunch of people that seem to really be into the Avatar, and specifically Kyoshi. So, no, that definitely is, like, a really cool thing, in terms of, like, going back to these episodes, just because of, this is probably, like, one of the things that we know the most about now, I think. So that's really cool to experience.
Yeah, like just the fact that, like, we know that this place, like, used to be called Yokoya, and we have just more of these like details about what it was before, why Kyoshi did certain things, and so on. But it is pretty interesting. I think with this one, I think we should just get out of the way some of the smaller plot points. the Aang and Katara plot. I think it's fine, but it feels very early series kind of plot point where it's like, oh, Katara like almost inadvertently ignores Aang in like a couple of scenes. So Aang's a little bit upset at that, so he wants to double down on impressing Katara, but she again misses seeing some key moments. And so when Aang actually meets some people who are interested in him, it goes to his head. Katara gets a bit jealous, and it's just this little bit of a thing where like they don't communicate that well at certain key points. But ultimately, in the end, they do communicate well, they apologize, and we move on. I kind of like that it ends up being one of the few times where it's like Aang and Katara, where they have a little bit of a like argument that is not directly related to like the romance development as such, where like this is just like we're still quite early on, and while the romance is maybe involved here to a certain degree, it's mainly just the whole impressing type thing. So it's fine. It works. The scenes with Aang impressing all the girls are kind of like funny, but it's definitely not one of the stronger arcs. It leads to some cool moments, and that like all the scenes of Aang riding the fish are cool. Katara gets a very cool moment, waterbending the water out of Aang's lungs. That's a very cool technique that sort of like gives you a glimpse into the future of what you can do, of like, oh, there's no limitation of like if you can just bend water in people's body, what else can you do? So there's bits and pieces like that that I do actually quite like, and I like this sort of nuanced ending as well, that Katara's like, no, you did the right thing, Aang, by leaving. He jumps into the water, does the crazy unagi thing, puts out the fire. Katara, honestly impressed at the end, hugs him, and so it ends on this note of like Aang has like impressed Katara in like the right way, not by trying to like show off and be like a braggart about it or anything like that, but just by just being Aang and doing something that he wanted to do to help the town. That has actually truly impressed Katara, and I like that. That's how it sort of ends. That the drama-y rest of the episode leads to something good. But what are your thoughts on this Aang and Katara plot?
Yeah, it does eventually lend to something pretty good at the end. I mean, it's sort of like you said, it's early days in their sort of relationship here. I mean, they really haven't known each other that long at this point. Like, they have been traveling, but you can see that they're still figuring out, how they're going to work with, each other at this point here. And Aang, I think, that's sort of part of his character, is sort of the show off, the sort of whole trickster, prankster part of him. So, it's definitely, one of those times where he's having to learn, I guess, more so like how him being the Avatar actually affects himself and other people around him. Since, like I think they mentioned in this episode, like, she's happy for him to actually like, be positive for once for being the Avatar, considering, what he's gone through and what he will eventually have to go through. But, and, he is still a pretty young character. They're all pretty young at this point. It definitely gets to him, which is something that you can see pretty clearly in this episode and that they illustrate here. So, I don't know. I like that he has, they both have this little bit of arc here that goes throughout the whole episode. I think it's a nice, I guess you could say, like learning experience for him being the Avatar, and he definitely has more of these coming. But you can see an early on one here, which it works for this episode, even if it isn't sort of like the biggest thing that could probably be done in a couple other different ways. But it's one way to get it through, and they have the runtime to do it.
Yeah, and I suppose the only other reference to this is probably like the Aang plot in The Promise, where it looks like it's maybe going down the same path of people who are super like impressed by him because he's an airbender and he meets the fan clubs, and Katara is almost ready to react the same way as she does in this episode, but then Aang actually reveals that no, in this case his connection is not because it's like all these kind of cute girls being impressed by him, but it's more people showing an honest interest in his culture. And almost Katara realizing that, like, oh, that's maybe something I could be doing a little bit more of myself, and that being a slightly different take on it that's actually probably better done because it plays into a few interesting dynamics. But it's just a subtle connection there. What's the first thing from this episode you want to talk about?
I mean, I guess I'll just go with the other main part is just sort of start getting into Sokka and his sort of arc in this one.
Yes, the Sokka is a sexist arc. So I think straight away, like, yeah, they like you said earlier, they needed to resolve this early on in the series because it's it's a tricky thing to deal with. You don't want your audience, you don't want all your characters around this character thinking that he's just sexist the whole time. So I like how they do this pretty much like start to finish. It's actually really impressive how quickly they get through this arc that they could have easily slipped up on and made him very unlikable. But they get captured, obviously, when they arrive. And then Sokka makes some comments about, like, we're the real people who captured us. You're just a bunch of girls. And I like that Katara actually sort of speaks up at this point and is basically like, please don't kill him. He's just being like an idiot. That even Katara, who has called Sokka sexist before, is aware that like it's not that like he hates women or anything like that. Like it's not like wildly serious that like this is a major problem for Sokka, but that it's more of just a, like we discussed I think in the first episodes, it's he is raised, and the last couple of years of his life is he's been the only like guy in his village his age. He is the only warrior left in his tribe at this point. So when he says that later in the episode, it's true technically, but not like really. So I like that Katara is like aware of that like Sokka, you shouldn't be killed for saying this, but please improve. So that helps to sort of immediately calm it down, that even Katara is kind of saying like he's just being like an idiot here, that he kind of like we were discussing with Korra, that she's sheltered and because of that she doesn't have a great sense for this and that. This is something with Sokka, like he obviously doesn't have a lot of experience about the warriors in his tribe being women because a lot of the waterbenders are gone. He's not used to, he hasn't seen, apart from his sister, any waterbending warriors. So if all he's known is that like his father and the men of the tribe, that's what is said in the opening monologue, they're the ones out at war, not the women. Like that's partly part of the culture, and I suppose the South is better than the North, but I guess not that much, I guess. So it's that, and then the important thing obviously is that he gets completely humbled by Suki when he goes in to train with them, but it's actually him trying to show them up, but it gets reversed on him. But then he immediately comes back and just apologizes and actually goes as far as to ask to be trained. And I think that dynamic there kind of shows that it'd be one thing if he just apologized and it was left at that, but the fact that he's actually like gone the complete opposite direction of going from making like fun of them, of like, oh, you're just girls, you're not warriors, to actually being, oh no, you're actually really good and I want to be trained by you, that changes things, I think. So I think that, and how like I suppose humble he is in this scene, means that Suki, even though she I suppose took offense to some of what he said earlier on, is like, oh, that was surprisingly good. So I think they do a lot of good work in the early scenes to get across that like it's not an extreme view that Sokka has. This is just this thing of Sokka experiencing the world, changing him needs to happen, and here it is happening. What are your thoughts on the first couple of scenes here with this arc?
Yeah, no, I think the fact that he seems to recover so fast from it, I think that, like you were saying earlier, that, it's just sort of like he doesn't really have a lot of experience. Like, he's not necessarily sexist or anything like that. He just doesn't, I don't know, like he just doesn't know better at this point. Like he's not, he's not inherently like a bad person in terms of, that point of view versus some other characters. Even if they do apologize, they wouldn't go so far as, much as like to humble themselves to actually, asking for help in that regard. Because usually that might be what would happen here. But, it seems like he's going like the extra step, even though, later on when they're doing the training, he does sort of try to get a little bit full of himself, although he gets, sort of reprimanded pretty quickly in that regard. You can see that he's attempting to be sort of like a better person. Like even later on, he gets called like in the group of them girls, and he tries to say something, but then he's just like, oh, whatever, and just goes out to help. So it definitely feels like, the fact that they tried to resolve that so quickly is probably like one of the better things that they could do, and that is pretty much one of the main focuses of this episode as well.
Yeah, like it's all these little things where like there are things where he could argue at, but he ends up just being like, okay, I'm not super happy about this, but yeah, I'll do it. Whereas if he actually had a major problem with there being like female warriors, he wouldn't have dressed up in the outfit and gone through with the training with them. He would have made a big fuss about Oyaji, like, including him as part of the girls, come out and join the fight situation. But no, he just gets straight down to it, because he does learn from Suki and the others. And when they then reverse it, and I like that the episode is also willing to have that moment where Suki almost gets a little bit like ahead of herself, thinking that she's always going to be like better than Sokka in every single engagement. So when he knocks her over, she's a little bit like taken aback and kind of flustered that the tables have been turned a little bit again. And Sokka is just like kind of so happy that he's actually managed to do something good. That's a nice scene to have in there to show the, in a way, the quality of the scene, and that's what's going on here. And it's a quick scene, but I like that in just like a scene or two between Sokka and Suki, you can see a little bit of the dynamic. Obviously, it's very much just the sort of early days, and until the sort of kiss happens, you're not quite at romance, but you can see the idea of the fact that she sticks around when like the others leave shows that she's like interested in him in some way. And especially when you factor in Suki alone at this point, and that Mingxia's just left, so Suki is sort of kind of thinking, was I wrong? And then she meets this person who, even though you don't get the scenes of him explaining why he's with like Team Avatar, the idea is that like, okay, he's left his tribe, she knows potentially he's one of the only warriors there, he's not super skilled, but he's trying. He's doing this kind of brave act of helping Aang. And she realizes that like, oh, he's actually okay. And there's maybe a sense that like, oh, he's kind of doing like what Mingxia is doing. And this is ultimately what convinces Suki to leave, is meeting Team Avatar, but mainly meeting Sokka, because that's the main one she interacts with. So I like that they do that thing to just sort of get the idea that Suki is at this point still going with the sort of the status quo of the island, which is Kyoshi told us to stay out of the war, be isolationist, and not like get involved in things. But you have to get involved in this, and if Sokka's doing it, despite not having the skill, I should be able to do it too. And again, like in reflection, if they had known about the Suki alone stuff, maybe they could have hit it a little bit harder, but I think it roughly works, trying to like tie it in. But what are your thoughts on some of this stuff, tying in the comic in?
Yeah, that's a fun bit to consider now, seeing, where she actually eventually gets to, how she, forms them, and then eventually even where, they end up in the end sort of like working with like Zuko and everything. There's a pretty, drastic, I guess, sort of change from what they initially thought that their purpose or their goal actually was. And Suki is definitely sort of leading the main group here, in terms of where they actually go to later on. And just her general character and her being like interesting and battles and everything like that, it definitely makes up for her being one of those fan favorite characters that everyone really likes.
Yeah, and the fight and the way it happens, it is interesting the way they kind of show it, in that Suki goes in, gets hit by the Komodo rhino. Sokka actually defends Suki from an attack, again showing the sort of bravery that he stands up in that moment. And you sort of see in this that like Suki is not like in this specific instance as like strong as she maybe is in later scenes, and that in the final battle she gets like hit like 2 or 3 times by like Zuko. So it's clear that when she actually leaves the island and kind of helps in the war, she kind of improves along the way, to the point where she's doing this incredible stuff at the end of the series. So it just highlights that she is still very young herself. She's the leader, but she's just basically the same age as Sokka. So they kind of both in a way need the experience. Suki has more of a formal, proper training, I suppose. But Sokka has maybe like a slight bit more experience in these kind of crazy battles, even though he's basically just had one before this. So I like that idea as well, that they kind of weren't afraid to kind of like show Suki as also getting like hit once or twice as well, because like Sokka gets smashed as well by Zuko, obviously in the fight as well, because they have to have Aang be the one to fight him. But what were your thoughts on the way they actually did the fight here, of Zuko for the most part actually like defeating a lot of the Kyoshi warriors?
Yeah, I mean, I like that it shows you sort of like their tactics. I mean, you get to see sort of their initial capture of the group, but you don't get to see much of that. You just know that they're really quick and fast. But when you actually get to see the battle, you actually get to see, they're able to sort of like use their environment. They're able to sort of like come up from behind. It's sort of, they fall apart when they get into sort of the one-on-one or the head first sort of confrontations, because understandably probably they're not really like experienced fighting these type of firebenders, or just firebenders in general of this sort of caliber, which we sort of have the idea at this point that Zuko is pretty skilled. Like he's not too bad. He also has the Komodo rhinos that he's riding, so he uses that towards his advantage as well. So this is one of those really like early on fights where our main heroes, like you mentioned, like they're not really that good. Like they're good for their age, and overall the fact that they can get away at all speaks volumes to like sort of their skills, or just sort of what they have around them. But they still have a lot to sort of develop over time, which is, the cool part of the show, is that you get to see them progress throughout the whole journey that they eventually get to. So I like that, Suki isn't immediately like super OP or anything like that. Like she's better than Sokka probably, even though he does at least, dodged Zuko's initial attack when they do have that confrontation, although he still gets kicked away a second later. But it's probably just because he's experienced that once before that he gets at least one avoidance there. But yeah, no, I mean Zuko here, he's he knows what he's trying to do and he's trying to get better, and he's really driven at this point. I mean he almost burns down the whole village, which is funny when that comes up later on.
Yeah, and that's the other point of like going back to the whole Kyoshi Island is isolationist, is that I guess the Kyoshi warriors wouldn't have had a chance to fight if they've kept out of the war. That basically means I guess they haven't faced firebenders, or if they have, it was just some random scout maybe or something like that. So again, like in the same way that Sokka ultimately improves by going on his journey with the group and becomes this amazing warrior and leader, it feels like Suki effectively does the same along the way. And even though we maybe don't get the greatest sense for like how many battles she's been involved in, it feels like just being with the group along the way, she does drastically improve as well. So that's good to see. Which brings us to the big scene here, the little romantic scene, the goodbye. And I like that, Sokka again tries to apologize again for treating her like a girl when he should have treated her like a warrior. And then we get Suki's like big line, her key line: "I am a warrior, but I'm a girl too." Kiss on the cheek. Very memorable scene. And I think it kind of like really highlights the character of Suki. Of like, they specifically chose not to have her want to like constantly have it over Sokka's head that you were sexist to me the first time, and just that be her character of just constantly having to get one over on Sokka, and that's the whole thing. Instead, she has this sort of like reasonable, like open-minded approach where like, oh, we made fun of him the first time, rightfully so. He came back, humbled himself, apologized, wants to be trained, took the training seriously. I actually quite like him. And just that kind of like honesty of character, like the sincerity of this, that's what I think is so fun about Suki. Like, she's not the most sort of like, like deep character necessarily in terms of like she's got all these like crazy aspects to her character and so on, but this kind of open-mindedness is quite good, especially when you sort of realize, like again from Suki alone, that maybe some of it comes from her realizing in the middle of this episode that a lot of what Ming-Jia said previously in the comic was true, and that she needs to change a little bit. And it's good, and just highlighting that, yeah, she ended up being like somewhat attracted to him at the end, and that's perfectly fine to happen as well. So overall, like I like the way they did this, and it basically never comes up again, the whole Sokka is sexist thing, and no one in the fandom really tends to criticize the character on the basis of like the first 4 episodes. So complete success overall, I'd say. So what were your thoughts on this kind of final Sokka Suki scene?
Yeah, no, I think it is a pretty good success. The fact that, they're able to have, this sort of realization of this character and the actual show a possible, budding romance here as well. I think it really does to highlight, not all the times I guess the characters have to have so much to them that you're having to like sort of like figure out all of their like perfect motivations. I think when we do get the comic, that definitely does flush out a lot more in terms of Suki's history. But initially at least, that's not all that's actually, sort of needed. And especially since, it wasn't necessarily considered that she was going to be, around all the time. No, not as much as always sort of put into those characters. But I think, even if, this was like the last that we saw of her, it was definitely a great, first appearance for this character. And the fact that she was so loved, she came back for more and more and more. So I think that's worked out really well.
Yeah, that's the main thing coming out of this episode, definitely, is that it obviously, because of the production, it took them a while to realize that, like, oh yeah, people really like Suki. Oh, we're doing like, what, 212, 13 at this point. Why not bring Suki back? And it makes complete sense. And yeah, like they again have another sort of like brief appearance, but then come back much stronger in the 3rd season, to the point where she's fully part of the group at the end of the show, and in fact have people like being upset when she's left out of group shots of Team Avatar and stuff like that, and people wanting just her to get the full treatment as a Team Avatar member and not be just treated as like the minor character who joined the group at the end, and be like, no, she's one of the main cast now. Like, she's earned that, and she needs to be included in more action figure lines. Like, there shouldn't be these covers with Team Avatar without her, that sort of thing. Final points for this episode is mainly just a few quick facts. The whole Oyaji says she was like born 400 years ago. There's our big timeline error that basically requires Kyoshi to be like over 200 years old. I'd love to know the details on this. Like, I get it, we're only in the 4th episode here, and they've just dated when a past Avatar is. And I'm wondering, is it just a thing where, like, did they only decide later that Kyoshi was going to be like the one before Roku, and maybe it was meant to be a thing where like she was a bit further back? But either way, they made a pretty bad error here, because the cycle of the elements is set. So it's either she's here, and it probably should have been like 200 years ago, or like 250 or something like that, or it should have been more, and she's the cycle before. So it's an unusual kind of one, and it highlights they made a couple of these mistakes as we go on. They consistently get timelines wrong by somewhat big amounts. And in this case, it's like, okay, I get it gets somewhat complicated by the fact that like you have the 100-year gap, so you have to be like everything plus 100 anyway. But it's kind of impressive that they like added like double that on here. What are your thoughts reflecting back on like that? This is where the whole Kyoshi's 230 comes from, and what actually happened here to make this go so wrong?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, sometimes, I mean, and I wonder because, sometimes it's just in terms of like how you're producing, you're writing the story, you sort of throw out dates and, you hope it sort of works. So, and I'm sure when they were initially making this, the whole idea that this was going to be sort of this like grand epic tale that goes on forever and has a second season, and now we have all this other stuff from it, might not have been particularly the focus there. Because I mean, I think it makes sense that Kyoshi, in my mind at least, would be one of the more recent incarnations, just in terms of having like some relatability to like the current series of what's going on. Like if you were to put her 2 generations back in terms of the cycle, would that mean as much to the characters that are living in the here and now? I would be maybe a little bit hard pressed to think that might hold over as much, unless it's like an island that is very, very sort of like Avatar spiritually focused, like the sages, maybe they would keep that sort of heritage, or sort of the ones on Bonte Island or something like that, the ones that we see later on that are really sort of focused in that sort of history of the world. I could see a place like that having such reverence for an Avatar, but for one that was like say like over 1,000 years ago or something like that, or close to it, that would be a harder thing to sort of keep in mind, I would think, at least. So I don't know. It kind of makes sense that that's how it's placed here. It's just kind of unfortunate and funny that, this causes the whole idea of why, Kyoshi had to have lived as long as she has, which I don't know. I mean, it's the Avatar world. Who knows how things can really work with, the abilities that they have. And I think, the way that they do it in the books in terms of how it works, I think, even though some people will still be like confused about how that like really, really works and everything like that, I think, in terms of the story, it's fun how it works.
Oh yeah, the Lauga thing, yeah. Whenever anyone like brings that up and they're like, "Oh, I don't care about spoilers, just tell me what happens," and you're just like, "Oh well, this guy Lauga, and he has this like whole philosophy, and it's like it's this kind of like spiritual technique, and some people will argue that it's an earthbending technique, but I don't think it is. Not confirmed." It's just like okay, but for anyone maybe wondering, wanting a recap on it, it is effectively the spiritual technique where you tear like the identity of yourself like apart, like sort of on a spiritual level, into like tiny parts, and reassemble yourself without the sort of like cracks in a way like associated with aging, and you have to have this really clear cut like visual of the you that like you are, and you sort of lock yourself in as that, and that's how you basically stop aging effectively, is that you are able to constantly like keep your body at that like sort of spiritual ideal of yourself. The exact details of it are like not gone into a lot of depth. It's just this kind of idea of like, okay, yeah, you can like earthbending being stagnant, and you have the quote about like the violent river, basically dies numerous deaths, but the pool of water that's just sitting there lasts forever, basically. That's the basic idea. So yeah, that effectively exists because we need to explain this little error that happened here. Um, Foamy Mouth Guy in this episode, it is interesting that he actually debuts before Cabbage Merchant does. It's just one episode, but it's interesting that back to back we have probably our two best sort of like funny meme characters. So that's kind of a fun little moment. The how Zuko finds out Aang is on the Kyoshi Island via the fish is actually a really cool little sequence.
Mhm.
I don't think there's too much to say about it, but it's just like you probably didn't need to go into that level of detail, but it was nice how you did it because they actually explain in quite a lot of detail about like how like Zuko's like, oh, like I don't know where they are, and Ira's like, yeah, none of the crew can figure out either. They're a master of evasive maneuvering, but it's just like actually Aang island hopping to find animals, and that's why they can't find them. Um, there's that, and I'm pretty sure that's about it. The only other thing is just little things like Kyoshi information, like say, Suki, when she explains like the significance of the Kyoshi warrior getup, only explains like the sort of like the armor, the clothing, and then the significance of like the color gold, but not the makeup. And it's actually the Kyoshi novel that explains to us the significance of the Kyoshi makeup, and that it's the colors of the Dao Fei group, the Flying Opera Company, and that the white represents, you know, treachery and sinister acts, and the red represents honor. So it's kind of funny to be like, oh yes, Sokka is technically wearing Flying Opera Company colors in this scene, um, and then just like a weird note that like I completely forgot that like he's still wearing the Kyoshi warrior outfit like when they leave, so he technically has that with him for like the next couple of episodes. I know they lose stuff along the way in like I think the pirate episode and stuff like that, but he had a Kyoshi warrior outfit for a while. But any other kind of final points for you on this episode?
No, I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I think there's gonna be a bunch of the book one episodes like this where we hit the 2-3 main points, and it's just like, yeah, here's a lot of these facts and stuff like that that should be mentioned and then moved on from. But yeah, that's a review for 104. The next episode we have, we'll actually be doing our first episode where we review 3 episodes. So we'll be doing just the one Korra episode. So we'll be doing K105, Spirit of Competition. Yes. And then we'll be doing for Avatar 105 and 106. So King of Amashu. Is that the, yeah, that's the name of the episode, I think. Why am I doubting myself all of a sudden? And Imprisoned. So we'll be reviewing both of those episodes. The main reason for that is that to not have crazy amount of episodes doing the reviews, we will have to group up at least some of the Avatar episodes together. And then I actually went through it and kind of planned the whole thing out. So I know what each episode we're going to review each episode in. I also didn't want there to just be like 52 episodes. So I think I have it settled on like, I think there's going to be like 47 review episodes, and this is the 4th. So there'll be a few times where we group up Korra episodes. There'll be a bunch of times where we group up Avatar episodes. In this case, I think it's because most of 105 would just be us doing like a review of the jokes, which I don't think is particularly super interesting. That like, it's a funny episode. We don't need to go over every joke. There's only like a couple of main points, and sort of similar with 106. It's one of the sort of direct to the point episodes, and that's how that will work. The other group up of episodes is that usually when we did reviews previously, we always separated things. I've tried to group up 2-parters for this one. So we'll be doing like 107, 108 together. I think the 2 book 1 finale episodes are together and stuff like that. So that's the way it's going to work as we go on. There's no episodes where there's like 2 Korra, 2 Avatar episodes. I tried to organize it so we weren't going crazy on certain podcasts. And I think the way it works out, there's maybe only 1 or 2 times where there's actually like 3 quite important episodes that might make for like a really long episode, having to do 3 reviews. But that's it. So yeah, so K105 and then 105/106 for next time out. So that's going to be an interesting one in terms of like the traditionally what people call the weakest episode of Korra Book 1, the romance focused episode, and then with Korra, you know, Boomy intro episode, which is good, and then Imprisoned, which at least in my experience tends to get sort of like mixed reviews from the fandom, where it's kind of like, okay, do you like Haru? Yeah, no, yeah. But will be interesting, I think, because it's one of the few episodes that properly like explores like the Fire Nation versus the Earth Kingdom. So that's going to be quite interesting, because I think there might actually be a bit to discuss with that one when it comes to maybe the adaptation for like the live action, because I'm assuming they'll have to delve into stuff like that a little bit more. But what are your thoughts on the 3 episodes for next time?
Yeah, I think, I mean, those are the King of Mashu. That one I think always stands out for people just because of Boomy and, you know, it being fun. In Prison, it is, like you said, it's like either you like Haru or you don't, but it does a lot in terms of building sort of the world and where it's at, and sort of, you know, people being in prison, that's the name of it, of course. So I think that one, you know, does pretty well. And then the one other side on Korra, I mean, I think it definitely gets like the worst rap out of all of them because of, you know, the whole romance and everything like that. But it also has some cool beats in it that I think try to keep the pace up as well, so it should be interesting to see how those go.
Yeah, and then the other thing with Imprisoned is like it's one of the sort of Hope Tara episodes, which also can be a little bit like back and forth for some people in the fandom. I think it's pretty okay though, so that'll be exciting. But yeah, that has been episode 243 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.